Welcome to the podcast. This episode of Navigate is taking a slightly different approach as I get to talk about transitions with someone I've come to really admire in the world of coaching and resourcing Christian coaches and entrepreneurs. Her name is Teresa McCloy. Teresa is the founder of the Realife Process, which you're going to hear about today because Teresa and I actually partnered together to create this conversation for both of our podcasts. Teresa McCloy is the creator of the Realife Process, keynote speaker, podcaster, and a certified coach with the International Coaching Federation. Teresa partners with her clients as a coach, consultant, and professional speaker to forget being productive and do what truly matters. Through the Realife Process that includes the Enneagram Typology Profile, she serves clients to move from living with their hair on fire to discovering clarity about the life they want to live each day and the process to make it happen. Teresa lives with her husband Dale on their third-generation family farm in southern central Illinois. She still drives a tractor when needed and loves a great cup of coffee or long, lingering meal with friends. So join me today as I discuss transition with Teresa McCloy of the Realife Process.
Tim Austin, it is so great to have you on the podcast and be able to have this conversation with you as we're going to talk about transition and transition in our lives. But before we dive in, just tell us a little bit more about the real Tim Austin. Give us some scoop.
It's great to be with you, Teresa, and I love talking about transitions, so this should be a fun conversation. I live in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California. I've been living here with my wife, now empty nesters, just as of this year, going into an empty nesting season here and trying to navigate all of that. Our third child, our daughter, just left for a gap year mission trip to Costa Rica. The town we live in is a little town called Keynote, but the area is called Apple Hill, and it's known for everything apples. So basically there's apple orchards everywhere around here. And in the fall, we get all the visitors and all the tourists from the Bay Area and from the Sacramento Valley coming up to come to the apple farms and get things like apple fritters and apple pie and everything, apple donuts, everything apple. So it's a fun place to live here in Northern California.
Well, that sounds like a fun place. And I know your wife, Eve, and you as well, as you are facilitators with our Realife Process program. And listeners have heard me talk about that on the podcast. We were just talking before we started recording about your wife's Eve office and the new area that she has there. And it's really tempting me to want to come to California. So now you've given me another reason why I need to come to your area. I saw her office yesterday over Zoom and it looked amazing. And then now you're telling me that there's this Apple thing going on. So I think I'm going to have to do a fall visit to southern. Are you in southern or northern?
We're in northern
California, which I've never been to. So that would be really fun.
Yeah, which is night and day from Southern California. So, and this is still kind of new to us. I mean, we're native Northern Californians, but we spent 20 years on the mission field in basically two countries, Tajikistan and Turkey. So our last post was Istanbul, Turkey, where we lived for several years. And then we transitioned back to our native Northern California and landed here. And still our hearts are drawn overseas and all the work and connections we had over there. But we're enjoying this new season.
And that kind of leads us to even what we want to talk about today, right, Tim? As your passion as a coach, as an ICF certified coach, you really work with people around this idea of transition. And you just mentioned several transitions that you've had recently, and then moving even from one post, as you call it, to another. And we know for many people, we're recording this in January of 2021. Been through a pretty difficult year this past year. Most people have. And for some people, the first of the year is all about transition, or maybe they have found out at their work environment that know they're going to be working from home for quite a few more months. And that's still a transition that they're adjusting to. So tell us more, if you would, about this idea of transitions in our life and what are areas that we see and what might we want to notice when we're in a season of transition.
So it's interesting because transition can be talked about and looked at from so many different angles, from kind of the macro big piece of what's next and how do I process that and navigate this season of my life where some changes, big change is happening, or even in the moments. So, but and some of that is a good this time of year just kind of naturally lends itself to engaging with a process that helps us lean into the next thing. And so I think for me personally, I'll just share around some of the big transitions that have happened in my life over the last 6 or 8 years. So the first the big transition we made was as a family moving from Tajikistan, where we spent 16 years of life and ministry there, working and serving there in that country, to the country of Turkey, where we didn't know the language. It was a new culture. It was a huge thing. And then the next transition came after following 3 years in Turkey, I think your listeners can probably relate to this, just some internal sense of restlessness, some discontent, some things happening internally, like that were kind of clues to maybe this season of life and work overseas is coming to a close, and we're moving into something new. What does that look like? How does that, and so God is always preparing us for the next thing, even though a lot of it is just happening inside and so for me, I think some of the things I struggled with was on the desire level, just getting in touch with my desires. And I think that's a big thing for when it comes to change, especially when it's a big change, like a career shift or big life and ministry changes, getting in touch with with our desires, giving ourselves permission to dream and brainstorm and think about what could be. That's hard to do because we don't always feel that freedom.
I love that though, Tim, as you talk about that bigger desire and something you said a little bit earlier of the macro transitions.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would assume the micro, small little things. As you're sharing about, some of these transitions for you that were macro transitions and that internal discontent, for someone who's might be in a macro transition or even considering it, listening to their own desires, taking notice of their internal discontent. Can you give me some ideas of what do you do with that? Like, what did you do to hold space for that discontent and then the noticing of those desires? Any ideas or thoughts around that for people that might be right there in that macro transition?
I think what you just said, holding space, creating space for a reflection and getting in touch with what your desires are, what's important to you. So for me personally, I began to write things down. I'm not a big journaler.
Me neither. So there we go.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily journal, but I began to write things down, themes that I began to. And I also had a personal coach at the time when I've been going through these big transitions, and that really helped me create space to process some of the things I was wrestling with in terms of my identity, my purpose. Who am I if I do choose to take this next thing, or if I do choose to move into this next thing? Who am I then? What's my purpose? And so. Just being able to process that with somebody, also write. That's the time during my first big transition of moving from overseas when I started a blog, and it really was just a therapeutic for me to be able to write it out. And then I said, well, I might as well post it, see if it could help somebody.
As we work through our own things, sometimes it is that therapeutic and we end up creating content or writing a book or doing whatever around it. As one of our facilitators of the process, you and I were actually on a call together this morning in kind of the group meetings that we have each week. And we talked there even about the value of community, and whether
Right.
that's one-to-one community, whether you're working with a coach, a spiritual director, a mentor, a consultant. There's lots of different types of people you can work with. You and I are both coaches. We love that process of that forward look, but having someone in a macro transition, especially, that you're processing your thoughts with, those internal desires and even the discontent piece, a
Yeah.
safe space. Tell me more about the value of that, Tim, what you've seen even as a coach and then as yourself walking through it.
For me, a lot of it was focused around redefining what calling means and vocation means. And I think that's really when it not exclusively, but it is often something we who have been in full-time ministry, whether that's missions or pastoring, some kind of what we may call full-time ministry, wrestle with, and in terms of what is calling. And it really began to help me as I began to process some of this and allow that in that space for God to meet me there, was to really come to this place of, hey, it's not the calling and the vocation, it all remains, but there's different expressions of that. And that once I began to learn that there's, calling can take on different expressions and manifest itself in different ways in certain seasons of our lives, that really freed me up to begin to dream and to explore. Well, what could that look like? And then of course the whole area of self-awareness comes in, which I began to learn more about myself. I hadn't come to the Enneagram yet. That was later in terms of working with you. So, but I had some other areas that I was exploring, some other tools I was using to begin to become self-aware of how all of these experiences in life and how they prepared me for this next season and to express my calling in a different way. I like to think of it in terms of preparation also, like to reflect on kind of this whole idea of we have and the character of Joseph is a really great example of this, how there's inside preparation seasons, and then there's outside preparation season. So that meaning like where I feel like, you feel like, man, this is hard and I'm not really functioning in all of my skill sets here. And this is really, really difficult and challenging, but I have to do it. And yet, even in those times, God is preparing us for the next thing. And
yes.
Then when we feel like, then there's other times we feel like we're in our sweet spot and we're inside there in that sweet spot of really expressing ourselves and our gifts, and bringing our best self as the Real Life Process talks about to the world. That to me was a really rich, fertile ground for processing transition.
And I love what you're saying there about the inside and the outside, because many times when we feel ourselves moving into the inside and we're wrestling with those internal desires and that discontent and all of that, many times that is leading us to some sort of transition. It can be something, and it might be 6 months, a year down the road, but it starts to stir within us. And it can be something simple, or it can be something life changing, career changing, whatever it might be. Here at the process, we kind of divide things into knowing your real self. If you imagine a triangle, right? Knowing your real self, living your real life is in the middle, and then real work is at the top of that triangle. And this part that you're talking about, your calling, and that term has been used a lot in the ministry space or in the church space. But yet you and I think both agree that it doesn't matter if you're doing that. You're in a vocational space where you're an entrepreneur or you're a business owner, whatever. You have a calling on your life to do what you do. But when we move into sometimes a different transitional pull and that stirring starts to come, that is a difficult space to say, is this still my calling, or is my calling shifted? And I'm shifting. And you mentioned at the beginning, you're moving into empty nest season. And seasons of life, I'm in that season as well now, as I'll be 60 this year and our daughter's getting married, and transition, right? They can be personal, they can be professional, and those all bring with them a new season. So our seasons of life have some to do with these macro transitions that we're talking about as well. Share with us the transition you just recently walked through and kind of some things that came up for you as you were walking in that transition.
Yeah. So when we came back from overseas 6 years ago now, it was really kind of this blank slate. I mean, we had both, my wife and I had desires. She's a marriage family therapist, wanted to start her own practice. That is happening. I wanted to move more into full-time coaching with a big focus on missions and ministry coaching. I had that desire, and I started out on that process. And yet, God is so good, because He knows when we're ready to take the deep dive, the plunge.
Yes.
And so for me, it wasn't time to let go of everything completely and to start full-time coaching. So He graciously opened a door for me to come in as the executive pastor in our local church for, it was about almost a 4-year time period. And I just wrapped that up. But that was such a gift, because it allowed me the freedom to keep moving toward the full-time coaching piece, but also have something to provide some stability for us in the short term.
Yeah.
And and I think in terms of transition, a lot of times we're not ready. And I think giving ourselves that permission sometimes we feel the pressure. We have to totally let go of something and embrace the new. And I think sometimes Bridges, I think it's William Bridges, in one of his books on transition, talks about the mountain climber. If you're climbing a mountain, I think of climbing a rock wall. I've never done it before, but how you with one hand you're holding on to something for leverage and for stability, while you're reaching for something new.
I think what you're saying, I think what you're saying there, Tim, is so encouraging to people, though, because so many times we think we have to let go with both hands, right? And go, okay, I got to jump, I got to lean. And there's something to be said for taking risk. And, as you and I both know from personality types and work we've done on personalities, like for some people, it's really important to take the leap and the risk. But for other types, as you say, kind of holding on, and you were provided, God's provision for you was an opportunity to be in this executive pastor role while you were building your training, while you were getting established back in the United States, building your community online and locally, all the things that you needed. And I think that's encouraging to people listening to the podcast, for you to say, it's not always, transition doesn't always mean cut your ties, move on, don't look back, all of that. It can be a long-term thing. You might know that in 2 years, 3 years, you have a goal to do something, but what does it look like to get there from now till 3 years from now? That's some of the work we do as facilitators of the process, as creators of the process, is help people set those short-term kind of projects, is what we call them, to get them where they want to go, whether that's into a new career, whether that's growth or development. And I'd like to transition just a little bit, if we could, because I think you really set us up well. We talk a little bit about these macro transitions. Tell me what a micro or a smaller transition, or you have an example of something that's a little bit smaller than like the career change or the move around the world or some of those types of things.
Yeah. I mean, for me, and maybe this is just the season of reflection that I'm in right now.
Sure.
It's centering around these short transitions are really, for me, it's focused on the moments in my day, even, or a rhythm that I have throughout my week, so that I can pivot well, I can transition to the next thing well. And we, John Eldridge talks about this. We live in such a culture of efficiency, and efficiency is great, but if we sacrifice margin for efficiency, it's not sustainable.
Oh, I
So
love that. I love that
I,
because
I'm being encouraged personally to allow my soul time to transition to the next thing. Believe that in between times are God's invitations, providing an opportunity to transition well, to be attentive to my own soul and what I need. If we're not aware of that, those little moments can pass. But just to pause, I'm learning just to pause and to thank God in the moment, to be there in the moment, to be more present, to even say, what are you saying in this moment, Lord? But it's helping me to just kind of, and those are really micro transitions, right? Just
right. But I love what
thing.
you're talking about because, again, as we work with the process, one of our steps is step number 3, where we set up that calendar, right?
Yeah.
We put margin in our day. I'm so with you, Tim, as we can pack our days so full, so efficient.
Yeah.
And I think as we bring this very present to how all of us are living right now, so many of us are doing online space, working from home, maybe not having as much transition to and from work and all of those, that it's like, wow, I can get so much done. I'm not driving 3 hours a day or whatever it is. And we pack too much. And so having that margin, we often call it white space because that's kind of how it shows up on your calendar. Having that margin, whether it's 30 minutes between appointments or time to actually sit and eat lunch, right? Or
Right.
Go get a cup of coffee and walk around the block, or any of those types of things where we're just present to our own self and our own self-care and soul care, but then also can be present to what's next and who's next
Right.
that we're going to be with. Such important to think about how we transition, from one thing to the next within our day, from maybe our quiet time into the work time, from the work time back into the evening time, how we're allowing our head, heart, and body, as we look through the lens of the Enneagram, to make those transitions. So thank you for giving us that macro and how you work with people around both things. How you communicate the idea of transition around both things, because I think that's really important. I'd like to ask you one more thing before we kind of wrap up and explore this just for a little bit too, Tim, of the idea of sometimes we're in these, probably this is more back to the macro, but we're in these transitions and we kind of run into some roadblocks along the way. We get stuck. Sometimes is the term we use as coaches, right?
Yeah.
What are some thoughts that you have around how people can kind of continue moving forward in their transition, in their dreams, their desires, around those transitions? Or what are some ways that when you got stuck, maybe out of fear, maybe out of anxiety, maybe out of reaction, overreaction, whatever, what are some tools, maybe, or tips you might give us for those spaces?
Yeah. I think for the especially big transitions, there's a lot of uncertainty that goes along with that. That embracing that uncertainty, I guess I'm trying to think how to say it. I think it's important to normalize this uncertainty in transition seasons, because we often think, am I the only one who feels a lack of purpose or doesn't know which end is up here? And, just to normalize it and say that's such a common theme in big transition seasons, uncertainty. And then not only come to the point that just to recognize it, but then also to leverage that and say, okay, how can I embrace this uncertainty and leverage the space maybe even just because of COVID, there's more space in this season of COVID for you to leverage that uncertainty and turn it into something positive. So ways we can turn it into something positive, and this all can either be roadblocks or opportunities, I think. And one of those ways is greater self-awareness, working on, I call it design. We can go through long seasons without really tackling that, issue of who am I? And that comes up in transition, and that uncertainty around that. So self-awareness, the Enneagram, other tools that are helpful. But I'm loving exploring the Enneagram now since I've started my training with you, Teresa, and have become a facilitator of the Realife Process. I'm loving exploring that. And so
being a little bit transparent here, even as we've worked together, I know we talked about this on some of the calls that we've done together, is one of the things for you as a type 9 on the Enneagram, a 9 that brings peace. 9 represents kind of that peaceful space within the Enneagram circle. And one of the things for you that you've really moved into, not into full-time coaching now as at the first of the year, but adding someone to your team, and that transition of bringing on a team member, and how that's felt for you as a 9 to give you some forward energy to let go of some of those things. And that self-awareness piece has been huge for you, of like, wow, as a 9, it feels good for me to work with someone else. And you did a lot of exploring around that as you walk through this transition in the past few months, that feeling of, gosh, I'm going to transition into this. And for many entrepreneurs, or what we would call solopreneurs, that idea of being by myself, coming from a full-time job and ministry team and all that, where you could collaborate. Tell us a little bit of what that felt like, because I think many people, when they walk into transition, a lot of people that listen to this podcast are eventually hoping to be in some type of entrepreneurial space or full-time coaching space or that type of thing. And how did you work through that to feel like, as a type 9, I do know that collaboration?
That whole idea of being a solopreneur, it gives me the idea that I'm alone in this, and that's where we don't want to be, is feeling like we're isolated, we're alone. It's all up to me, And I think I don't know if that's part of my 9, but it's certainly a part of my makeup, where I tend to invest a lot in the details and get in the weeds, in terms of the prep work and the admin and all of that, and maybe a little bit of perfectionism there. So I can get so caught up in the weeds that one of my words this year, Teresa, or my word for the year ahead, is create. And as a 9 who is an away, kind of has that away leaning, I lean away rather than
that
forward.
energy that's more of a way.
Yeah, the energy is away. This is a forward word for me. Create.
It is.
So I need to create. So how am I going to create? And I need a team. And I think if you're launching into something new like this as an entrepreneur, as a solopreneur, really thinking outside that narrow perspective of I'm alone in this, to who's on my team. And that has really, really opened up a whole new way of doing the work, and it's continuing to unfold as I hired a virtual assistant and handing things off to her, and the work that I can let go of, so that I can do my best work and focus on creating and engaging the people that God wants me to work with.
Many times, one of the biggest things, and we're talking about it a lot here on this podcast, when you go through transition, the macro transitions, the big ones, you need a support system. I think it's one of the reasons why, you're one of our facilitators, even last year, that you knew you were going to move into this coaching transition, and to have a group of other people, and to have a process that you could work with. I mean, I'm so proud of having you and Eve on our facilitator team, and you leading the process. You guys are doing amazing things. And I really want you to share, what do you have going on in the next few months? How can we connect with you more? And what are maybe some events that you have coming up?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, Teresa, community and connection is so important to have that as part of your team, and the real life process and being part of this community with you and the other facilitators and the other ones involved. It's been such a life-giving thing for both my wife and I. And
thank you.
And yeah, even if I hadn't become a facilitator in the process, I would still want to be part of this community because of the life.
Yeah, it's a great group of people. That's for sure.
Yeah, so many things, life, energy, accountability are there built into that system and that structure. So grateful for that. And we're moving into new things. And speaking of creating space, now that I'm moving into full-time coaching, I'm able to, this year is going to look different, my wife and I are going to be facilitating 2 or 3 retreats throughout the year. The first one coming up is on Valentine's weekend. So I think that's the February 12th, right around in there, that Valentine's weekend here in Placerville, California, in Northern California, in the area we live. It's going to be a close, intimate couples, actually a real life process retreat for couples. We're going to gather at a historic, it's actually the building, it's an old Victorian style home where my wife has her office. It's got a great place for us to hold the retreat. So it's a very beautiful area of Northern California, and we still have space for several more couples to join us for that. And then we're also projecting one in May and maybe down the road. But this one coming up is what we're really excited about. And then just other ways to connect is just, I think the main ways are just through my website. Go live on the website. You can look there at EncompassLifeCoaching.com.
So EncompassLifeCoaching.com is the website for Tim. You can find out all of his upcoming events. Definitely check out if you're in his area or you want to travel and you want to travel in, drive in, whatever, the Valentine's weekend that's coming up here in just a few short weeks. And they're going to be walking through all 4 steps of the real life process as a couple. And that's so important to do as you look at your real life view. What's the roadmap that you want to create? What are the projects that you want to walk into? How do you want to put those things into your calendar and your time that you spend together and you spend separately? And then how do you sustain that through real life living? So they're going to walk you through all 4 steps of that in this great weekend retreat. I am so excited to hear about that. You can check it out on their website. Or if you're in a season of transition and you're looking for a coach who can not only walk with you through transition, but also help you in that forward thinking, using some tools in the process, using the Enneagram, Tim would be a great person for you to connect with and work with as you work, whether it's micro transitions or even what we talked about in those small, the big transitions, the macro transitions or the micro,
and everything in between.
And everything in between. And all those margins and spaces that we go throughout our day. So, Tim, thanks so much for having this conversation with me today and just walking us through a little bit of getting to know you, but also all the ways that transitions are going on in our life that we may not even be aware of. I really appreciate your knowledge and information.
Appreciate you having me, Teresa, and appreciate you so much and what you brought into our lives, and also just the coaching community and the world of entrepreneurs and with the real life process and all that you're doing as well. Thank you so much. I hope you were encouraged and got some takeaways to my conversation with Teresa McCloy, originally hosted on her own podcast called The Real Life Process. I encourage you to have a listen to that podcast and some of her many other episodes and subscribe because it's a great podcast. If you'd like to know more about using the real life process in the work that you do by becoming a facilitator like I'm doing, just reach out to me or head straight over to Teresa's website, thereallifeprocess.com. If you'd like to learn about the real life process in a retreat setting, head over to EncompassLifeCoaching.com and check out our retreat offerings. Our February couples retreat mentioned in my conversation with Teresa is sold out, but don't despair. We have another retreat coming in May right in picturesque Lake Tahoe. It's going to be great. And you can learn all about that one on my website. Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Navigate. One of the things I love most about what I do is helping my clients navigate transition seasons in a one-on-one coaching relationship. To learn more, schedule a discovery call with me at EncompassLifeCoaching.com, and I'll see you again real soon.